In the autumn of 1888, the gaslit streets of London's East End were stalked by a shadow. This was a nameless terror, someone who turned the foggy alleyways of Whitechapel into his own personal hunting ground. And his brutality, well, it would create a legend of pure evil. This is the story of the killer who would eventually call himself Jack the Ripper.
I love my work and want to start again. These are the chilling words from a letter sent to London's Central News Agency. It was a taunt, it was a promise, and it was a signature, written in red ink. You see, before this letter arrived, he was just the Whitechapel murderer, a nameless phantom. But afterwards, he had a name that's been etched into history, a name that even today still sends a shiver down your spine.
So this letter, the Dear Boss letter they called it, was at first just dismissed as some kind of cruel prank. But when it showed up in late September of 1888, it gave a voice to the horror gripping the city. And more than that, it gave a name to the world's most infamous and elusive serial killer. And you have to understand, literacy rates were on the rise back then, and London's newspapers were fiercely competitive. So of course, they seized on this story. They published the letter, and the name Jack the Ripper, it just exploded across the city. Suddenly, a murderer was transformed into this terrifying folk hero, a character in a real-life horror story that people morbidly read about with their morning tea. Now, to even begin to understand this killer, we have to understand his world. So let's step into the Whitechapel district of 1888. It was a maze of poverty and despair, really the dark underbelly of all that celebrated progress of the Victorian era.
I mean, this was a place of just deep desperation. You had thousands of people packed into these squalid slums. Crime and violence, that was just part of daily life. And for so many women with absolutely no other options, survival meant selling their bodies on the dark, dangerous streets. It was, tragically, the perfect environment for a predator to hunt completely unseen. And for his victims, women living on the absolute fringes of society, it was a place where they could simply vanish without a trace.
4 pence. That's what you're looking at. This tiny sum was the price of a single bed for one night in what they called a common lodging house. It was a fee that many of the Ripper's victims desperately struggled to earn each day. And if you failed, well, that meant a night out on the cold, unforgiving streets, right where the killer was waiting. And so it began. For 10 short weeks, from late August to early November, a period that would go down in history as the Autumn of Terror, this anonymous killer would claim at least 5 lives, and each murder was somehow more brutal than the one before. First, Mary Ann Nichols, a mother of 5, separated from her husband. Then, Annie Chapman, who was struggling with addiction after the tragic loss of her daughter. Then, in one single night of just shocking audacity, 2 women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. And finally, Mary Jane Kelly. She was the youngest, murdered in her own bed. You have to remember, these weren't just names on a list. They were daughters, wives, mothers, real people, stripped of their lives and their dignity, and bound together forever by the cruelty of one man.
With the murder of Annie Chapman, a terrifying new detail emerged. Her uterus had been removed from her body, and it was done with a chilling precision. The police surgeon, a Dr. Phillips, was the one who suggested the killer had to have some kind of anatomical knowledge. And that sparked a horrifying new theory. What if this phantom of the slums was actually a doctor or a surgeon?
And then, as if he wanted to prove that taunting letter was real, just 3 days after it arrived, the killer did something truly audacious. It was his most terrifying act of violence, an event that would forever be known as the double event. Okay, so picture this. It's 1 a.m. Elizabeth Stride's body is found. Her throat is cut, but there are no other mutilations. The investigators, they believe the killer must have been interrupted, that he fled. But he wasn't done for the night. No, his bloodlust wasn't sated. Less than an hour later, and not even a mile away, the body of Catherine Eddowes is discovered. And this time, it seems the killer, enraged at being interrupted, unleashed an absolute frenzy of violence. He removed her kidney and her uterus.
But the final official murder, that was the most horrific of all. See, unlike the others, Mary Jane Kelly was killed indoors, in the privacy of her own small room. And this gave the Ripper time. Possibly for hours, he performed his ghastly work, leaving behind a scene of such butchery that her own landlord would later say, it looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. It was just an act of utter depravity, and it was the terrifying climax of his killing spree.
So with each new murder, you can just imagine, the public's fear escalated into widespread panic. London, the very heart of the British Empire, was completely paralyzed, and the police, who were tasked with catching this monster, found themselves utterly, hopelessly outmatched.
Really, the investigation was almost doomed from the start. You have to remember, this was an era long before forensic science. There was no such thing as fingerprinting, no DNA analysis. Crime scenes were immediately trampled by crowds and even the officials themselves. The police were just drowning in hundreds of hoax letters and totally conflicting eyewitness reports. On top of all that, widespread anti-Semitic sentiment was misdirecting their efforts with false leads.
And the press? Well, they certainly didn't help matters. With every single gruesome detail they published, they just fanned the flames of hysteria. Jack the Ripper became less of a man and more of a malevolent force, a kind of bogeyman for the industrial age, whose terrifying myth grew with every single headline.
The public outcry against the police's failure was absolutely deafening. I mean, the killer was taunting them, operating with total impunity, and the authorities just seemed completely helpless. The pressure became so immense that London's police commissioner and even the government's home secretary, they were forced to resign in disgrace. It was a total catastrophe for them.
As the years turned into decades, the question just lingered. Who was Jack the Ripper? Believe it or not, over 100 suspects have been named over the years. But the truth? It remains just as elusive as the killer himself. But among this gallery of ghosts, a few names have always consistently risen to the top. At the time, top police officials seemed to favor two men in particular. First, there was Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish barber living in Whitechapel who reportedly had a great hatred of women and was committed to an asylum right around the time the murders stopped. Then there was Montague Druitt, a barrister whose own family suspected he was, quote, sexually insane. He took his own life just weeks after the final murder, which, of course, provided a very convenient explanation for why the terror suddenly ended. Then, fast forward to the 21st century, and suddenly, a bombshell. A researcher claimed to have actual DNA evidence from a shawl said to have belonged to Catherine Attawos. And the DNA? It pointed directly to one of the prime original suspects, Aaron Kosminski. It seemed like, after all this time, the mystery was finally solved.
Or was it? The celebration was pretty short-lived. You see, other scientists took a look at the findings and they discovered a critical error. The specific DNA marker that was identified wasn't some rare mutation. In fact, it's shared by over 99% of people of European descent. The smoking gun turned out to be nothing more than smoke and mirrors. And just like that, the case was wide open again.
And of course, in the absence of any real proof, countless theories have flourished over the years. Could it have been a member of the royal family, part of a massive cover-up by the establishment? Or what about Jill the Ripper, maybe a woman, a midwife perhaps, whose bloody clothes would have gone completely unnoticed? Theories even point to a famous artist hiding clues in his work, or a member of the Freemasons, protected by a secret brotherhood deep inside the police force.
So after more than a century of investigation by police, by historians, by generations of amateur sleuths, where are we? Well, the truth is, we are no closer to knowing for sure. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's greatest, most chilling unsolved mysteries.
Because after the absolute butchery of Mary Jane Kelly, the murders just stopped. The letters ceased. The killer, whoever he was, simply melted back into the London fog that he came from. He left behind nothing. Nothing but 5 brutalized women and a legacy of fear that has lasted for well over a century. He was never identified, never brought to justice. His true identity is just a blank space in the annals of crime, a puzzle with the crucial piece forever missing. And so the final haunting question remains:
passed down through generations, and now to you. Who do you believe he was? Who was Jack the Ripper?